This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
He's one of the most infamous characters of the Old Testament, but what do we, in fact, all of history, really, but what do we know about Nimrod? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Our experiment with the green screen seemed to go okay last week, so we're going to try this again this week, and we'll see how this works when I'm dividing the screen into 4 sections. It's as we're still a work in progress here in the barn. Again, thank you if you contributed to help us put this new studio space together. We sure appreciate it. This is still a work in progress. This is not really the setup that I'm envisioning for long term because this green screen has got me closed in and feeling just a little, if I were claustrophobic, this would be it. Anyway, joining us to discuss the original rebel in the Bible, at least the original human rebel, or perhaps semi-human rebel, is the director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology and author of Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim, Dr. Judd Burton, best-selling author, award-winning screenwriter, author of the new theological thriller, Cruel Logic, and also the series Chronicles of the Nephilim, Chronicles of the Watchers, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, nonfiction books such as When Giants Were Upon the Earth, When Watchers Ruled the Nations, God Against the Gods, and more. Find him online at Godawa.com. Brian Godawa, and the author of Conspiracy Theory and the newly updated and revised 10th anniversary revised expanded edition of Giants, Sons of the Gods, and also featured in the recent docuseries Angels and Giants. Pastor of the Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado in Boulder, Doug Van Dorn. Well, guys, I'm surprised that we've made it 23 episodes and we have not yet discussed Nimrod, given that he is one of the topics that is often something that people really gravitate to when they begin to realize there's more in the Bible than most of us were taught in Sunday school. Let me start with you, Doug, as the theologian and pastor here. What do we know about Nimrod, and how much of it is reliable information?
Well, I suppose it'd probably be the best to start with the scripture, right? So we know about him from Genesis chapter 10. This is the table of nations, the 70 nations. And he's really the only guy that gets any playtime at all in the story, except for Peleg, who gets a tiny mention because the earth was divided in his day. But other than that, Nimrod by far and away is the guy who gets the most things said about him. So starting in about verse 8 of Genesis 10, and this is the Hebrew, so the Jewish Bible. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that, he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. And then he's mentioned probably a couple more times after that, but that's what we know about him. But it's also worth mentioning and reading, I think, the Septuagint. So now the Greek translation from about 200 BC. And Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a giant upon the earth. So what they've done there is they've taken the word Gibborim that we find in Genesis 6 related to the Nephilim, which actually the Septuagint translates both Nephilim and Gibborim as giant. And so they're doing that here. And so that gives us a connection to the Nephilim, at least in the minds of the Septuagint writers. And then from there, it's mostly the same. He was a giant hunter before the Lord God. Therefore, they say as Nimrod, the giant hunter before the Lord. And then the beginning of his kingdom was Babylon. And then it lists the rest of those cities as well. And I think one other thing for the text is also worth mentioning, which is that at some point in time, and this we see this in the Targums, we see this in, I think, Pseudo-Philo. We certainly see it in Augustine and some of the church fathers around there, that when it says that he began to be a giant hunter or he began to be a mighty hunter before the Lord, they actually translate that Hebrew word there which is a possible translation as against the Lord. And the main reason why this it seems to be, is because of his name. So Nimrod, his name actually means the rebel. And so the idea is that, well, how could a rebel be some kind of a guy that's, doing something positive for the Lord, like maybe hunting and bringing sacrifices or something like that. And so they started to see this in a very negative light. And, from there, the speculation and the connections with mythology and with the Tower of Babel and with the Nephilim and all kinds of things just go crazy. But that's the basics that we can know, and we can rest on that for sure.
Brian, you've done a lot of research, in fact, produced nonfiction books about the giants in the Bible to kind of inform the readers of your Chronicles of the Nephilim series. What did you come across in Nimrod, both inside and outside Scripture?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot outside Scripture, and as you mentioned, there's a whole history of Nimrod. I think most of what people believe about Nimrod today, unfortunately, is just a lot of legends. I'm not against legends, of course. I draw from them for my novel series. But nonetheless, a lot of legends, and a lot of it goes back to Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons, where he was an anti-Catholic just trying to, prove his whole thing against Catholicism and such. And, he's been long proven false, and a lot of stuff in there was made up by him. And unfortunately, there's a lot that people, claim about Nimrod comes from there. But, the question is always, who is Nimrod? And there's a few things I think to take into account. The name itself, Nimrod, it's very common for the Hebrews to name people not based on their actual name, but either their own Hebraic version of the name, which could be different. All nations did that. They would have different names for different people in different cultures from their own language. But also, they would, like Doug already said, they would sort of develop a name for that person that they would call, it's called demonizing, right? So Jezebel actually was an example where her name was actually Isabel of Tyre, but Jezebel adds this thing about the dung heap, Jezebel means that sort of like where, Isabel means where is the prince, and that's Baal. But then Jezebel is like prince of the dung heap or something like that. So, and there's lots of other places in the Bible that I've written about. And Nimrod's one of these where, most scholars think, it's probably a demonization, calling him rebel because they're addressing a very prominent king, but in the biblical writer's eyes, he's deeply negative. So the question is, who was he, in history and legend and all that? And there's been a lot of options. Several major ones is either he's a deity or human, right? And the deity, one of the most popular ones that I've come across in terms of scholarship is that he was Ninurta, which was a Hebrew, what do they call it? Hebrew demythologization of a Mesopotamian god, Ninurta of Sumer, who was a warrior god and also a hunter and all this. And there's been made connections with Ninurta. That's a real popular one with a lot of scholars that I've read. But there's also another one, Douglas Petrovich. I think he's done some really interesting work, and he's an unusual scholar in that he believes the Bible. But he's made an argument that it's Sargon of Akkad. And right. I think he's made some really good arguments for that.
He was a guest on this program just a few weeks ago and made that case. And so we've kind of gone through that with Doug. And I don't agree with him about everything, but he's really made a convincing argument for me. But there are some implications then if we identify Nimrod as Sargon, then that shifts him in history from where I placed him in my books. So we'll talk about that. But there's some really interesting.
Gotcha. Yeah. And likewise, Likewise, me as well. But, and then lastly, there's Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh has also been it's been an interesting one from scholars. And of course, in my series, I chose Gilgamesh. But I didn't do it because I believe this is the answer. I actually am not decided on the Nimrod issue. I think there are some good cases for all of them. But I chose Gilgamesh because it fit the best with the storyline narrative I was using. And, and so in my novel, Abraham Allegiant, I have Nimrod, and Nimrod's in the time of Abraham. And that's another one where people disagree, Nimrod was 1,000 years before Abraham or whatever. But I drew heavily from the ancient Jewish legends. Ginsberg's Legends of the Jews has it, but he drew it from some other texts, some Targum texts, the Midrash, and also a book called the Book of Jasher. And that is a book that has a lot of interesting stories about Nimrod and Abraham. And I actually drew a lot from there. And I didn't want to be original in my story for Abraham Allegiance. So I like drawing from the ancient legends and just sort of incorporating them and updating them. And so there's this interesting stories about Nimrod and Abraham and how Nimrod had a dream about this man who would rise up and displace him. And so he seeks to find him and kill him. And he finds Terah, his father, whose Terah ends up being on Nimrod's, like chief of his army or something like that. And he offers him money to give up his son when he was just born, so he can kill him. And then Abraham, Terah's like, well, what do I do? It's like, because if he's king, so he'll kill me if I don't kill my own family. So he pays one of his servants to give him their newborn child, and Nimrod kills him in his stead. And then of course Abraham, grows up and Nimrod finds he's still alive, and he tracks him down, throws him into a fire, and just like Daniel, Abraham survives it. And then ultimately it makes the claim that Nimrod was also renamed Amraphel, who was one of the 5 kings of the plains that were defeated, by those in Genesis, what was it, 14, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And there's giants connected to all those kingdoms, but this makes the claim that he was Amraphel, which is also not uncommon, to have named different kings in different situations, different names sometimes. So all that interesting storytelling I put into my novel, but do I believe that is the case? Not necessarily, actually. But one of the reasons why I think it could, the Nimrod pericope, as we call it, is difficult to make these decisions is because I'm kind of in the camp where I think Genesis 1-11 is not strict history. And so, there are some arguments that even the Tower of Babel, and that's the other thing, that Nimrod built the Tower of Babel, which that's not necessarily in the text that we're reading, but it's definitely in the traditions, right? But there's good arguments that he didn't, I can see both sides on that. Consequently, so what I'm getting at is I think that there sometimes, how can we put this? There's been some good arguments also that Nimrod and the Tower of Babel itself is sort of what would you call it? A symbolic history of the kings of Mesopotamia. The way that the Hebrews saw all of them, they're embodied in this one symbolic king named Nimrod, but it really represents all those kings of that land from which, there comes a lot of tyranny and such, and particularly Babylon, because they were in exile in Babylon. So that story may have originated in that time period when Genesis was edited later on. So there's all these kinds of arguments that I think they bear weight. So I don't really come down on any one particular, but those are just some of the characters that I read about. And like I said, I've heard good arguments on all of these, and so I'm interested in hearing what you guys also have to say about it.
Well, Judd, your research has been deep into the Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Gibborim, the mighty men, and the connection, as Doug mentioned, with that word between the Gibborim and the Nephilim. Why do we associate Nimrod specifically with the giants, or how solid is that connection?
I tend to think that it's a pretty solid connection just based on the language and the association, the fact that those words are as Doug pointed out, when we see them first in Genesis 6, both of them show up. So there does seem to be a connection. Now, obviously, linguistically, there are going to be cases where Gibberim, means humans. It means mighty people. But there are other contexts where there, as I think the Nimrod context is a good case of this, that some sort of change is clearly taking place. A metamorphosis of some sort is more than implied. And that may have something to do with Nimrod's family history, so to speak. Doug laid out the canon scripture, and Brian referenced the apocryphal material. It's in some of this apocryphal material, like in Jasher and Jubilees, that we get some really interesting, perhaps insights on this transformation, this becoming a Gibberim, becoming a giant. Because if you look in, I believe it's in Jubilees actually, where we get an account of, basically mirroring the Table of Nations, an account of Nimrod's family, and our people like Arphaxad and his father Cush are interesting insofar as that there seems to be this tradition of empire building to begin with, and so that sort of sets Nimrod up as a sort of heir to that, but he's also a kind of prototype for the Antichrist in a lot of ways, which I'm sure we'll delve into later in the broadcast. But one of the interesting things that I found out that may have that I've read in the past, I'm sure you guys have too, that may have direct bearing on this transformation that takes place, is the fact that I think it's Arphaxad that rediscovers the writing of the Watchers. Again, referencing the Jubilees material, the Jasher material, and uses it. The whole family and Cush uses it too. They use it to build their own empire and cities, which, again, the Table of Nations seems to be tying in with there. But all of us know the apocryphal traditions and the canon traditions that are associated with the Watchers, and this tutelage that they pass along to humanity, which included, this form of magic, a twisted version of the mysteries of heaven, alluding to Enoch. And so I suspect that this is at least part of that equation that we're trying to put together, in terms of Nimrod becoming a Gibberim, and then becoming the really one of the earliest, if not the earliest, mega empire builders. And so that's why I say that there's a kind of family tradition of empire building, if we're to believe, if we're to believe the apocryphal material as kind of commentary on canon material. And another interesting aspect of all of this comes from the apocryphal material as well, and we get this account of Esau being the one who ultimately is responsible for killing off Nimrod, which brings it directly into the patriarchal period. And without chasing too many rabbits here, I wanted to point out another thing that's really interesting about Nimrod, is that if because of this metamorphosis that takes place, we need to take into account that there are certain unnatural attributes that should at least be on the table here that Nimrod can take on, and one of those may be an unnaturally long life, and that could go a long way towards explaining the different names, the different titles and eponyms that are given to Nimrod, such as the aforementioned Amraphel, his association with kings like Sargon in the north, and yeah, there's at any rate, circling back to the giant issue, I think that there's some key insights that can be drawn from the commentary offered by these apocryphal sources on certainly the mechanism via Nimrod's transformation.
Or it could just simply
into
be it's not necessarily that he became, but he was the first to be one of these Gibberim, these giants. And by the way, I want to throw in here for
Sure.
another word for Gilgamesh was First of all, I do. I think that I'm not sure where I come down. Is this Gibberim connected to the giants? But I think it could be in that the last time, later in the time of David, we read about his mighty men being called Gibberim, right? But if you think contextually, it's a good argument to say, well, look, this is right after the flood, and what's right before the flood, the Nephilim are described as Gibberim, and then right after the flood, the first to be a Gibberim, it would make sense that there's a connection there. Absolutely, I think that makes sense. But Gilgamesh was also, that's another reason why people argue for Gilgamesh, because he was claimed to be 2/3 God, 1/3 man.
Right.
And that he was a giant as well to some degree. And that was another kind of cool connection, And Gilgamesh is known as a mighty hunter in the text, and he was described as a tyrant. He was at the time of the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, he was the king of Uruk, but he was a tyrant, and he would abuse his people, and he would also abuse women, take whoever he wanted, prima nocte. That was long before Braveheart, where the king would sleep with the wife to be at a wedding, right? And he would do that, and so he has all those, but then he goes on his quest, and it humbles him, or does it? Because ultimately he ends up. There's the flood story, and he ends. The flood story. There's a connection there, right? And he's looking for Utnapishtim, and there's also a linguistic connection between Utnapishtim and Noah, Utnoapishtim. And he seeks him because he's supposed to have eternal life, and he can't get it. So that makes him bitter before God, right? So again, just some more connections that on behalf of Gilgamesh, shall I say?
I think it's important to kind of step back and say from the biblical text how you could get kind of these three main things that Brian brought up. So you said it was Sargon, right? So here's a guy who would be fully human. And, when you just look at the genealogy of Nimrod, he's coming from, completely human lineage. So that would kind of lend itself towards that sort of an idea.
Yeah.
But you also then have, like we said here with Gilgamesh, the giant thing is right there, seems to be implicit. So a lot of people went that way. But then you also have the Ninurta thing. And when you go look at Ninurta, he's full God. So you have to go, well, what about that? Well, the thing is that of all these characters, he seems to share the most traits with Ninurta, including very possibly his name could be derived from Ninurta. This is why it makes it so complicated, because in the text itself, you have the name going one direction, you have the giant going another direction, you have the lineage going another direction.
Yeah.
And so is this guy a composite of characters? Is he representing a host of characters?
And by the way,
his own thing. And so, that's the reason why this is such a difficult thing to try and figure out.
I was just trying to say that, and the Ninurta angle is the one that also supports a sort of, this is symbolic history, not literal history. In other words, he represents the Mesopotamian kingship as the god over those kings, and they're humanizing him, bringing him down because Yahweh is above all the gods, right? And he becomes the symbol of that Mesopotamian region and all their tyrant kings, So that's the argument that the scholars make on that. I find them all really interesting. I love reading all of them.
And you can also make the connection into Greek mythology with Ninurta being related to Hercules because of the 12
labors of
great acts of Hercules, the 12 tasks of Hercules. Yeah, Ninurta has something almost exactly the same.
Yeah,
and so here you have possibly just being connected with a great hero from Greek mythology. So, I mean, it's complicated, and like you said, Brian, it's completely fascinating. I had a guy in my church before he had his first kid, and they were pregnant. Knew it was going to be a boy. And I said, well, what do you want to name him? He goes, I think I want to name him Nimrod. I said, well, why don't we have a look at Nimrod? I'm pretty sure you don't want to name him Nimrod. So we did that, and it was a pretty funny little study. So
this is, as you said, Brian, a lot of what we think we know about Nimrod, a lot of what is out there in the public domain derives from Alexander Hislop's Two Babylons, which is around 1860, I think, was when it was published. And this would include his marriage to Semiramis, who was an historical Assyrian queen, but she lived in the 9th century BC. So whether we identify Nimrod, the historical Nimrod, as Sargon the Great, who lived in the 24th century BC, or if we put him in the Uruk period of history, when Uruk was the dominant city in Mesopotamia, a period that ended around 3100 BC. Either way, he was living in the wrong millennium for Semiramis, and the idea that he was the father of Tammuz is just, right out. Hislop was just basically throwing stuff into a blender and coming up with a sort of a supernatural smoothie to use it to try to bash the Roman Catholic Church. But the best paper that I've read on this was in the Harvard Theological Review. A couple of the guys who are connected to the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible, Van der Toorn and Van der Horst, wrote a paper on Nimrod before and after the Bible.
Good Dutchman, by the way.
And the connection to Ninurta is in there. But Judd, as we look at the corpus of Mesopotamian texts, do we see anything that would suggest that Nimrod was ever worshipped by anybody, anywhere, at any time?
None that I can think of. So much of the misconceptions stem from Hislop's book, and even the identification of the site that he supposedly derives so much of this from is misidentified in his own time. Trying to remember the archaeologist. I want to say that it was Laird. Maybe
I think it was
that excavated Nineveh.
I just saw that today.
Yeah, I think it was Henry Laird. Yeah, right. So he identifies the site of Kala, which is referenced as one of the cities in Nimrod's kingdom, as Nimrod or Nimrut, because there were local legends and a lot of identifications of sites in the golden age of archaeology in the ancient Near East sort of fall prey to this. The local folklore that Indiana Jones teaches about in that one scene, in the classes, the danger of folklore. Well, this is one of those. It caused a misidentification of the site, and because Hislop associated so many of these things, with that site, because of the naming of the site, it gets a lot of the imagery from that site. Including no less a trope than identifying Nimrod with Santa Claus, just because of the imagery completely misidentifies the deer and the flora that are represented in it. And I'm trying to think of. I should have a lot of this on my mind because I've been rereading the Enuma Elish. But I can't think of any off the top of my head other than sort of the misidentifications that Hislop made in his awful
we had actually suggested and I think Mike Heiser may have suggested this some years ago, that we needed to put together an annotated Hislop, because the two Babylons is in the public domain. We could take it and we say, okay, here he was doing okay with what he had to work with, but here he's just right out.
Yeah.
The sad thing is, because it's become so accepted by so many. I think it would be brilliant.
Well, I would say this, though, that
I started on that project.
You probably would have some good material, but a book that I recommend that is available already is by Ralph Woodrow,
right,
called The Babylon Connection, and he has written a book where he critiques Hislop. I don't know if it's not annotated like you're mentioning, which would be interesting, but it is quite in depth as well.
And Woodrow was one who preached quite a bit.
But again, if we're
Woodrow had been preaching on the Nimrod. Woodrow had been preaching on the Nimrod as the Nimrod Semiramis connection to the Roman Catholic Church, until he actually started digging into the archaeology and found that it was wrong, and that's why he wrote that book.
I think it might be worth talking about how you can get some of these local legends. And I came across a story where Nimrod supposedly was flying around on a bird above Mount Hermon, and he was dropped by the birds and he was almost killed. And it's like, well, where would you get this from? So, you have the Gilgamesh story where he's very close to Mount Hermon when he goes to kill the giant Humbaba. But there's something really interesting that you find in Ezekiel where it says, all the trees of Eden, the choice and best of Lebanon, all that drink water were comforted in the world below. And you could read that in two different ways. You could read them as a kind of antithetical parallelism, or you could read them as a kind of actual parallelism. So if you're living in Lebanon and you have some sort of a reason to say, hey, we are where the Garden of Eden was. Well, here's Ezekiel just proved it. See, the trees of Eden, the best of Lebanon. Garden of Eden is here. All of a sudden, then you have the Syrian fathers. So this is later, third, fourth century. They start writing about this cave of treasures that's on top of basically Mount Hermon. And this is where Mount Eden was. And the sons of Seth never really left the Mount Hermon, and all the children of Cain go below it. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's all these legends of Nimrod having built Baalbek. A lot of people will say this, right? Well, where's Baalbek? It's in Lebanon. Well, where would something like that possibly arise? I mean, it's possible, I suppose, that it's true, but it's probably more likely that you have a kind of a localizing of a myth, of a story in your own neck of the woods. Because, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why somebody would do that. And you can justify it with a text like this. And that's another reason why the story of Nimrod becomes so confusing and also so interesting when you trace them through history.
I think you're right, Doug. Another example of that preservation of that tradition in the region would be the fortress of Nimrod, which is just down the road from Peneus. That was built by, I think, I think either the Mamluks or the Umayyad, that's Umayyad with an M, not a B, were the ones that built that. But there's another example of those traditions being preserved.
So people will look at that
in the area. Yeah.
And
that's a late one. That's a
people will look at that.
That's a crusade.
There's been a fort there since ancient times. So obviously Nimrod was here.
Yeah.
I saw some graffiti that he left at the fortress, and it said Nimrod was here. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I didn't.
It is an interesting site, and you can understand why that castle would have been there, because it guards a very important road that connects Tyre to Damascus. So the Greeks, I think, are the ones who built that castle, and then it was rebuilt by the Crusaders later, and then the Mamluks took it over. But because of the size of the castle and the location, connected to Mount Hermon, it's not too surprising. We often connect, and again, this has already been mentioned, so we need to dig into this, I think, because if Dr. Doug Petrovich is right in identifying Nimrod as Sargon the Great in the 24th century BC, and Sargon, you could argue, was the first empire builder in history. He connected the Persian Gulf. His kingdom connected the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. So he would have been in the vicinity of Baalbek at some point. We connect Nimrod to the building of the Tower of Babel, but when you read the Bible, it's not explicitly mentioned in Genesis 11 that it's Nimrod who did it. We do see in Genesis 10 that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, bearing in mind that word Babel in Hebrew can be translated Babylon. And so you've got to, watch the context. I mean, is it referring to one or the other? Because either way, if we place Nimrod in the Uruk period of history, which ended 3100 BC, about 700 years before Sargon the Great, rose to power, Babylon itself was not founded until a couple hundred years after Sargon died, and it didn't become a mighty kingdom until the time of Hammurabi in the 18th century BC. So, 600 years after Sargon was really when Babylon became great. So
we actually saw this, Derek, in the Hebrew text where it says the beginning of his kingdom is Babel,
right?
And the Septuagint said the beginning of his kingdom was Babylon.
Correct, right. So there's a conflation of those two, which is how we blame Nimrod for the evil of Babylon, when regardless of where you place Nimrod, whether it's in the 4th millennium BC or 3rd millennium BC, he's still in the wrong millennium for the founding of Babylon. But Babel, and I know Doug Petrovich agrees with this identification, was probably the ancient city of Eridu, which was where the temple of Enki, the lord of the Abzu, lord of the abyss, had his temple. That was a very important religious site, even down to the time of the Neo-Babylonian kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century BC, where they still identified themselves as the king of Eridu. Hammurabi was crowned at Eridu, reportedly, even though it's like 400 miles away from Eridu, which is on the shore of the Persian Gulf. So there was a real serious, significant spiritual importance connected to Eridu that would that we don't know about today, because most people have never heard of Eridu, and we just assume that because Babel and Babylon sound alike, it must be the same. The thing is, if Nimrod lived it was Sargon, then he probably did not build the Tower of Babel, because again, that seems to have been done at the point during the Uruk period of history, because according to the archaeologists who dug at the site of Eridu back in 1949, they found that it was abandoned right at the end of the Uruk period. And interestingly enough, it appears that while they abandoned it, after they abandoned it, it was very quickly covered over by sand dunes, just as we record in Genesis 11. They left off building the city. So how does that influence our understanding of Nimrod if we disconnect him from the construction of the Tower of Babel?
Well, maybe as a qualifier to where we take the discussion next, the problem you run into with the scenario of a central or southern Mesopotamian location for Babel, whatever it is you can't really make a good case for a universal language at that period. And so it may be that we're looking for Babel in too far south. Linguistically, if you're looking for an approximation of that, I think probably temporally a better place to look, a better time to look, is when the Proto-Indo-European language shift is taking place. And this goes back to the wellspring from which most of the languages in Europe and Asia spring from. And there's some cross-pollination with the Proto-Semitic world, but the Proto-Indo-European world stretched from eastern Turkey up through the Trans-Caucasus, between the Black and the Caspian Sea. And linguists have reconstructed, for all intents and purposes, the mother tongue from which all of these Eurasian languages spring from. I wrote about this to an extent as it pertains to the Rephaim and my paper War the Words. But the Proto-Indo-European language shift, when all of these languages begin to descend and spread out, occurs about 6,000 BC, as early as 6,000 BC. And so, for all intents and purposes, the people that were scattered across that large region and probably in the peripheral margins of that area, for all intents and purposes, spoke dialects, mutually intelligible dialects of the same language. And so you actually do have a kind of model here for the world speaking the same language. So I think that's something to at least consider when scholarship, well-intentioned scholarship, points us towards central Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia. It's just that you don't have anything approaching the universality and the magnitude of something like the Proto-Indo-European language, which ostensibly had been spoken for millennia. That's really interesting. That's even begins.
Just going to say that's really interesting, because in the research that I did for the Second Coming of Saturn, found that the Hurrian language appears to have actually preceded Sumerian, because there are words in Sumerian, including Abzu, from which we get the Greek word abusos, the abyss. The Hurrian word abi appears to be the source of the Sumerian word, which kind of is counterintuitive to what we've been taught, that the Sumerian was the first culture with language and writing and all this, and it appears that they got it from their northern neighbors, the Hurrians, the Horites of the Bible, who originated exactly where you say this Proto-Indo-European language began, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the Caucasus.
So I think at the very least, it should give us pause, in considering a later and a more southerly location for Babel. Northerly. Yeah.
The beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech. And if Babel is Eridu, it would be in the vicinity of Uruk, Erech, which is in what would be southern Iraq today. Akkad has not been found, but scholars think that it's probably underneath modern Baghdad, which means it'll never be found. And then going further north, this would seem to follow or track with the military career of Sargon. If we start with Sargon, as something coming from the south and expanding his kingdom northward, but would also track with, if we go back to the idea that Nimrod was in the pre-literate era, because writing was not really discovered until about 3100 BC, at the end of the Uruk period, which is interesting. So if there was a common tongue, it would not have been written down, and there would be no way to confirm that, at least as far as we know at this point. So that could suggest that the earlier time period that Nimrod was, in fact, the one who built the Tower of Babel, was not to be identified with Sargon the Great. Interesting.
And again, if you think contextually, the beginning of his kingdom doesn't mean that he built Babel. It's just that the beginning of his kingdom was at Babel. So,
right.
Babel could have been before him. It's possible.
Sure.
I'm just, but then what did they talk about right after they talk about a few of the sons? The Tower of Babel. So,
right, yeah,
since it's so close and it's mentioning Babel, there's a higher likelihood that they are connected than not. I would argue,
And the only other guy that gets anything said about him is Peleg, and the earth is divided in his day. And it seems to me the most reasonable explanation of that one is that it was divided because the tongues were divided. So in other words,
right.
You have these two genealogies that are tracing two guys that the closest contextual answer to why they would be mentioned both seem to be pointing right at the Tower of Babel. So that's the reason why I think most kind of conservative Christians would take the view that Nimrod built it.
It's at least reasonable, right?
I mean, and it's also old tradition too. We can't leave that out. I mean, many Jews talked about that. So,
yeah, for sure.
Josephus ascribed it to Nimrod.
It's interesting because.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, that's true. And while he's not a final say on anything, he certainly is a good, strong voice.
Well, yeah, religious Pharisee, 1st century
But looking
AD.
at those, but I'm looking at those cities. So if Babel's Eridu, Erech, Akkad, you see a northerly progression. And Kalne, there's an argument no one's found that, but there's an argument in the Hebrew that it actually might be saying, and all those in the land of Shinar,
right?
And then from that, then you move up higher, Assyria to Nineveh. Rehoboth Uruk hasn't been found, but there's also a good argument that it could talk about Nineveh was considered a great city, and so Nineveh and Rehoboth Ur is a reference to the public places of those cities, Kala and Rezin, between Nineveh and Kala. So, but it's interesting because some scholars have pointed out that. And I wouldn't know the dates as well, but the impression that what I've seen is it does show a progression. The argument I could make, you could say that it's either a symbolic expression of the history of that region, right? Because Eridu was more primary, and then Uruk arose out of that, and then Akkad was later. So you see this progression, and then Assyria and coming to power, and Nineveh being in power is much later. So while you could argue, no, these are just the beginnings of those cities established by Nimrod, but it's interesting that they also tend to show a from south to north progression. yeah, that could be, the argument could be, well, that could be a progress of conquering, but it could also just be another, like I said, it's an expression of a symbolic expression of the history of Mesopotamian region, embodied in this, this mighty hunter that, like, all the kings were referred to as mighty hunters, but I also think there's a good argument that that whole mighty hunter thing, it's like, in the context of these cities, it could be read more as a slaughterer in the face of the Lord, meaning, he establishes this power. If he's tyrannical, this first to be a mighty man in the negative context of rebel. And if it is tyrannical, then it would make more sense that he's like a slaughter of human beings in the face of Yahweh, which would make sense coming out of the flood. And it's sort of like he's a rebel in the face of God, so, and then therefore it is said, so there's this saying like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. It's like, it's sort of arbitrary, like, oh, that guy's a good hunter, he's like Nimrod. No, it would make more sense if it's like, no, that king is like a Nimrod because he's acting like a Nimrod who was a slaughterer before Yahweh. That, I guess what I'm arguing is, I think that the context lends itself towards those kinds of those kinds of negative tyrannical sort of language rather than just a mere hunter. Mm-hmm. As Ninurta was a hunter, and they were all hunters, sure, but it just seems to be more to it than that to me.
I want to ask you guys a question about Nimrod becoming a Gibborim. So in a lot of these Nephilim circles these days, you're hearing things about how Nimrod was human, and then through some sort of transhumanism act or occultic ritual or some kind of marriage with the gods or whatever it is, he transformed himself into something that he was not, namely a Nephilim or something like that. And then you get comparisons with today with transhumanism and with, mRNA technology changing our DNA and all this kind of stuff to say that, see, this is possible today. And so I'm just totally curious what you guys think about that idea.
I know this is something that Tom Horn put that forth because he suggested that the verse in Genesis actually means he began to be a Gibbor on the earth, a mighty man. Sharon has suggested that because we tend to accept the biblical, we accept the biblical account that all flesh on the earth was wiped out in the flood, which would mean all of the giants. I mean, that was really the purpose of the flood, was to eliminate that the corruption, but also the forbidden knowledge that they were teaching humanity. So how did Nimrod inherit those genes? Sharon has pointed out, and she says this as a molecular biologist whose degree had an emphasis on genetics. And she graduated as an adult student, which means she actually studied when she was in college, unlike me. She suggests that epigenetics, through certain rituals, may have had something to do with it. Maybe there was some occult process by which certain genes were switched on that allowed Nimrod to have more power than your typical unenhanced human, your average guy, would have. So, I mean, it's speculation, of course, but that is one possibility.
Well, and I think that's a possibility that's informed by those apocryphal references that I alluded to earlier. If there's anything to our Faxid, recovering, these writings that were scrawled on rocks, apparently by the Watchers, then that has to remain a possibility that that there's some magical working that was involved in this, which implies that there was a sort of covenantal agreement made with a demon.
Well, there is something that caused Nimrod to be remembered throughout at least the last 4,500 years of history, perhaps even longer. I think it's really interesting that when the great powers of, who survived World War I, the French and the Brits, as they were carving up Mesopotamia and drawing these lines on a map to create these countries out of whole cloth. They decided to name the land of the ancient land of Nimrod after his kingdom. Iraq is just another transliteration of Uruk or Erech. Why did they do that? No clue.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I'd argued in a paper that I will link to in the show notes below, which I'm sure won't win me any friends among Freemasons, but I suggest that the symbol of the 32nd and 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemasons, the double-headed eagle of Lagash, is actually a representation of Nimrod, and that Hiram Abiff, who is plays a key role in, and it's been a while since I've researched this, so forgive me if I'm getting the details wrong, but Hiram Abiff, who was supposed to be the builder of the temple under Solomon, according to the Freemasonic rites, was actually a blind for Nimrod, the builder of the Tower of Babel. The double-headed eagle of Lagash does not exist in Mesopotamian symbology. It was created by the Freemasons and used to represent Nimrod, I think, who's being venerated by Scottish Rite Freemasons. But that's my interpretation of it.
Really?
So,
what Nimrods?
Exactly. What is really interesting is that in Armenian legend, the founder of Armenia, whose name is Hayk, Hayk, is supposed to have been the one who killed Nimrod in their legend. And Hayk is the son in their stories, the son of Togarma.
That's right.
The biblical Togarma. So Beth Togarma, which is Armenia in the biblical account, Togarma, the son of Gomer, the son of Japheth, apparently Hayk, Togarma's son, according to the Armenians, is the one who killed Nimrod. In fact, when you go to the capital of Armenia today, in Yerevan, there's this massive statue of Hayk drawing his bow, getting ready to kill Nimrod.
I have a follow-up question for you guys. This is especially for Judd here. So I would be remiss if I did not ask this after what I just asked. Well, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, Judd, but I don't know if we've talked about this on our show or not, but several years ago, it's my understanding that they went after the body of Gilgamesh. And
they found the tomb, they thought, right?
They found the tomb, and some think that they actually found his actual body. And you have told me that there's a couple of other of these demigods that they were looking for, may have found as well. And my question is, if Nimrod was Gilgamesh, so you obviously have to presuppose that for this question, but if it was, and if there's anything to this idea of him becoming a mighty man, do you think, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about the archaeology with him and maybe a couple of these other guys? And then second of all, do you think there could be anything to the idea of them looking for his body for some kind of nefarious purpose that might bring back this ability to become a Gibborim? And I'm asking this again because I hear this all the time with people in these circles, and I think it would be great to get some kind of an informed opinion on it for folks.
Yeah, I remember exactly where I was when I read that article from the BBC back in 2003. I was working for a heritage foundation in Lubbock. I was in grad school and came in and turned on my news ticker, and there's this story about the tomb of Gilgamesh being recovered. I think it was the Berlin Institute where the principal investigator of this excavation was out of. But I just sort of filed it away as, being interesting, as I myself was deep in the throes of archaeological method and theory at the time. I found it, very interesting, but I just sort of filed it away. I didn't really think about it until 6 weeks later when, we all start learning about the invasion of Iraq. And I thought, that's kind of interesting timing. I wasn't exactly putting my tinfoil cap on or anything, but I thought that the timing was rather suspect. And the story just sort of went away after that. And I would hear things in later years that made me question, some of the under the table antiquities sort of things that were going on. Most of us know about the Shamble, job that the Baghdad Antiquities Museum underwent. Our spec ops team was supposed to provide protection there, and I think we only have about 30 minutes of protection on record there, which people can think what they want about that. And again, I'm not going to delve into conspiracy. I want to just stay a little grounded here. But there are interesting things in the wake of that find, such as the issuance of these artifact cards, and I've got a deck of them here somewhere. But the Department of Defense issued basically artifact typology cards for the ground forces, so that they could be on the lookout. And on the surface, it seems pretty innocuous. It's all cultural resource management stuff. If you find something, don't touch it. Take pictures, record it. Flag it if you want to. But there were a number of these artifacts that they wanted them to look out for that were of a religious nature, which I also thought was very interesting. And secondly, sort of secondarily to that, is that although our armed forces do contract out to archaeologists, most of that is within the purview of historic preservation, and it's done on military bases and things like that. It's not really standing orders to put this much attention into cultural resource management being part of the military strategy of an invading ground force, which I thought was really curious too. And fast forward to today, I've heard from a number of sources about these remains being flown out of Iraq in an amazing state of preservation. There's some suspect associated items that show up in the Hillary Clinton emails that were leaked, including, if I'm not mistaken, Gilgamesh's own name. And that's just Iraq. That's not some of these other God King tombs that have been found. Like last year, the announcement came out that the tomb of Romulus had been found, and Romulus, of course, along with his brother Remus, were the gigantic founders. Gigantic, a quality that's preserved by Roman writers themselves, such as in Livy's History of Early Rome. The two founding kings of Rome, which also made me think about the excavations of what they thought was the tomb of Gilgamesh, and what potentially could have been taken out of there as well. If you take a look over the history of the last few decades of archaeology, there have been some of these God King tombs that are found, such as Pakal the Great, the classic era, I think it's 8th century AD, classic era Mayan king, who was supposedly over 8 feet tall. Again, it's easy to sort of delve into the conspiratorial aspect here, but at the very least, these sorts of finds, and particularly when governments and bureaucracies get involved, and should at least give us pause as to what's going on here and what the implications might be. Let's just say that they did find Gilgamesh. Why in the world, what use would the Department of Defense put the remains of Gilgamesh? I mean, the actual weaponization is kind of horrifying. Again, if we're using the Bible and the biblical material here as our point of reference.
I did some digging into this because it is
disturbing.
pretty sensational, and I didn't want to be repeating something that couldn't be documented. Here's the paper written by the guy who actually did that research. Okay? Jörg Fassbinder. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. And I looked it up, and I've read the paper. They didn't, according to Fassbinder, they didn't actually dig anything up. What they did was magnetometry to find magnetic anomalies in the soil so they could map the city of Uruk. And what they found was a building in what was formerly the course of the Euphrates River that seemed to match the description of the Tomb of Gilgamesh in the Epic. They didn't actually dig anything up, at least not officially. Fassbinder never said they dug anything up. In fact, the American Society of, they used to call it American Society of Oriental Research. Now it's American Society of Overseas Research. He's got an article Fassbinder did in 2020. So they've actually gone back to Iraq, and they've done more of this magnetometry at Uruk within the last 3 years. So I'll put links to those articles in the notes. People want to look at those. But as far as any hard concrete evidence that Fassbinder, his team, actually did any excavating, no. He never said that he did. Now, is it possible that spec ops teams went in and did something and didn't tell us about? Yeah, I suppose so. But we don't know. We can't document it. And I suspect that anybody who's claiming it as making a statement of fact out of it doesn't have any firmer documentation than we do. What we know is that the German team who was written about in that BBC article in 2003, because I remember that article too. When that popped up, it was like, whoa. I mean, this is archaeologically, this is a tsunami. But then when you read the article, they didn't actually dig anything up. They just ran their little scanner across the sand and they mapped out the anomalies so they could map out the city walls. They could map out the walls of the buildings. So that's what they did at Uruk. Now, again, was there, and I would suggest too, is even if they had found the building, how would they know? And also in southeast Iraq, which is kind of wet and hot, which is not ideal conditions for preserving biological remains. The odds that they would find any usable DNA, and again, I speak as the husband of a geneticist, or well, one who's got a degree in molecular biology and knows biology and knows a little bit about genetics. The odds that they'd find any usable DNA is vanishingly small. So it's interesting to think about the possibility.
Well, it would have to be preserved. It would have to be sealed, in something that was basically airtight. Again, the things that give me pause about this, and as an archaeologist, I would have to stop at the magnetometer sweeps too. But the thing that again, another thing that gives me pause is a good friend of mine that I went to grad school with. His grandfather was in the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, and my friend and I have had many conversations about this because his grandfather was a really interesting guy. But he remembers vividly because they watched this film over the course of his childhood, but he remembers the first time that he watched Raiders of the Lost Ark with his grandfather. And again, I'm not trying to sensationalize this. This is basically oral history. But my friend told me that once the movie was over, his grandfather told him that this kind of stuff went on. It's gone on for decades. I've seen it with my own eyes. And knowing the kind of person he is, these are the kind of things that give me pause about that. I mean, I realize at the end of the day, we don't know what we don't know. But it does seem. I
will say this.
It does seem
I've talked with Eli Marzulli and interviewed him about the Kandahar Giant, and have seen the interviews that he's done with the Marines who reportedly brought the body of this massive biped out of Afghanistan, and I found the account plausible. I've also talked with a fellow who was ex-Special Forces in Guatemala, who sadly did not survive the COVID pandemic, who had a friend that he had served with who is now working for the electric company down there, and reportedly in one of his jobs bringing electricity to one of the remote mountain villages in Guatemala was shown a cave by the villagers, which contained remains that were much larger than you would find among the people who live in Guatemala today. And this fella told me that, yeah, my friend does not make things up like this. So I'm not discounting the possibility that this stuff is out there. But, for example, the email that supposedly came from Hillary Clinton, it was actually, because I looked it up on the Department of State server, it was an email that was sent in to the Department of State by somebody asking about it. So it was not from Hillary or to Hillary. It was to the Department of State. It was after she had left the Department of State so she could run for president. And there's no evidence that, no record that anybody at State ever answered the person who had asked about the finding the remains of Gilgamesh. So somebody looked at it, assumed that, oh, State, Hillary, must be Hillary's emails. It's that they conflated some facts there, and sadly. But again, this information is so spectacular, we don't need to sensationalize it, just as the Bible, when you actually dig into it and understand what the prophets and the apostles knew, we don't need to sensationalize that either, because it's pretty sensational as it is.
Good note to end on.
Yeah, I think we've covered as much as we can. There's, as Judd said, I think rightly so, we don't know what we don't know. But certainly there's a reason that he is mentioned later in the Old Testament as connected to the land of Assyria, whether he lived in the 4th century BC, 3rd century BC. There's something about him that means he's still remembered to this day. And again, if I'm right in my research, that there are secret societies today who still hold him in some high regard for some unknown reason. Please check the show notes after you're done watching or listening to the program for links to the websites for Doug Van Dorn, Judd Burton, and Brian Godawa. And fellas, coming up, it'll be our 2-year anniversary with the next program, and I look forward to it. Check the show notes below this video or this audio, whether you're watching or listening, and you'll find links to the websites for Doug Van Dorn, Brian Godawa, and Dr. Judd Burton. And coming up, an epic holiday fail from Kmart in Australia. Details on a couple of conferences coming up, and our Israel tour as A View from the Bunker continues straight ahead.
Everybody, believe it or not, this is October, and that means you get a brand new GHTV special offer.
We're approaching Halloween, the time of year when the world around us is focused on ghosts and goblins and devils and demons.
But they're real.
They're real, and we'd like to give you good information about those entities with our October special. First, our book Veneration, where we analyze the ancient cult of the Nephilim, the origin of demons exposed in this book. Vicki Joy Anderson's important book, They Only Come Out at Night, about night terrors and sleep paralysis.
You need this book at home for your kids and grandkids. Trust me, it is a great book.
And 7 hours of audio interviews with the late Dr. Michael Heiser about the nature of the unseen realm.
Oh, this is a collector's disc.
It really is. Altogether, these 3 items purchased separately worth $65 during the month of October, just $35 plus shipping and handling. Take advantage of this because this is good, solid, scholarly information, especially the content from Dr. Heiser.
It is, and particularly this month, you want to be armed with the truth when your family asks, what about witches? What about wizards? What about these things at Halloween? What do we do with this? It's a time to teach.
Absolutely. Take advantage of our October special offer. Veneration, They Only Come Out at Night, and The Unseen Adversary, yours for just $35 plus shipping and handling only at gilberthouse.org/store. Driving the internet to think. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at VFTB.net. You can also find us at gilberthouse.org, my personal website, derekpgilbert.com. At YouTube, youtube.com/@GilbertHouse. And if you're watching on YouTube, thank you. Please subscribe, click the bell for notifications, and then guarantee we never get canceled by downloading our free mobile app. That app for iOS, Android, Amazon, Kindle Fire phones and tablets. All of our content right there, as well as a Bible with multiple translations. I counted today 9 translations, including a couple of non-English translations, Spanish language and French language, I believe, but also audio editions of some of these translations, so you can listen if you got to keep eyes front while you're driving or what have you. Much more there, and please take advantage of the messaging feature, which is sort of like a self-contained, almost social media site, but it's offline, so you don't have to worry about algorithms flagging you for, Christian content and stuff like that. You'll find the app at vftb.net. Look in the top menu bar, or go to gilberthouse.org/app, and you can get that there. Also, for your big screen, get our Roku or Apple TV versions, which will throw all the video right up on your big screen. Now, you can do it from your mobile device, too, using Google's Chromecast or Apple's AirPlay, but easier to do it if it's coming right into the Roku stick. So take care of that, and we will be good to go. Well, Kmart in Australia had to issue an apology because of an item that they had rolled out and featured for Christmas this year. Apparently, somebody thought that this would be rather cute and funny. Put an image of it up on the screen here so you can see it. You can see right away what the problem is with this little holiday device. Christmas-themed bag for hams, perhaps to give as gifts to friends, loved ones, what have you, but emblazoned with the label Merry Ham-mess. Yeah. Well, it's not spelled the same way as Hamas, but it's close enough. Now, I would suggest, as a Bible-believing Christian, that this is kind of tacky at best. I mean, all right, yeah, you're trying to have a little joke here, and that's, Christmas hams are a traditional thing in many households, but still kind of tacky at best. Now, giving Kmart benefit of the doubt, this is the kind of thing that you plan months and months in advance. So this was in the pipeline long before the horrific events of October 7th. So there's no way Kmart could have known this was coming. And to their credit, Kmart Australia said, we take full responsibility for this. We apologize. This was a mistake on our part, and they are pulling the Merry Ham-mess bags off the shelf. But like I said, at the very least, come on. Maybe we should treat this holiday, and setting aside the fact that we know that December 25th was not the birth date of Jesus of Nazareth, all probability September 11th. Just set that aside. The early church, in trying to calculate the date of Christmas, they based their calculations on the wrong date. They thought that Jesus was crucified on the 25th of March, and there was a tradition among the Jews that famous prophets were conceived on the same date as their death. No biblical support for that, just a traditional thing. March 25th wasn't even anywhere near Passover in the year 29 AD or 32 AD. So how they came up with March 25th, we don't know. But just add 9 months to that. That's where you get December 25th. Innocent mistake. But it is a time of year when we can say Christ, and the culture kind of lets us get away with it. So let's use that to our advantage, but maybe let's treat it with a little more reverence. So Kmart Australia, bless your pointy little heads. We're looking ahead to the new year now, as our travels for this year are complete. We are going to spend the next few months, finishing the setup inside the barn here, but also getting busy at writing. We've got a couple of writing projects, several actually. Sharon and I both working on novels. Sharon working on novel number 9 of the Red Wing saga. I'm working on a follow-up to The God Conspiracy, working titled The God Game. We've also got a nonfiction book in the works that will come out from Defender Publishing in 2024 called The Gates of Hell. Got to get busy on those. Sharon's now got her writing space set up. Mine is on the other side of the green screen here. And so we will be working on that through the winter months. Come next spring, we got a couple of things in the works. The Skywatch TV, the Gilbert House Ministries Tour of Israel is still at this point scheduled for March 31st through April 9th. But we're going to make a decision on that very, very soon. We've got a busload of people who've already committed to the tour, but we're not going to take people into a war zone or an area that's not secure. And Lipkin Tours doesn't want that either. So we will make a decision soon. If we need to postpone, we will let you know the new dates probably within the next 2 or 3 weeks. But as of now, we are still praying that the situation will resolve, security will be restored, and that March 31st through April 9th, we'll be there with our special guest, Timothy Alberino. If we're not there, there's a good chance we'll be in Dallas, because I had agreed to produce a video presentation for Hear the Watchmen for their Prophetic Signs in the Heavenlies conference scheduled for April 5th through 8th in Dallas. That's the weekend of the total eclipse of the sun, which crosses the United States that weekend. This is 7 years after the total eclipse that took place in August of 2017. Here, the Watchman was in Boise, Idaho for that one, and we saw the total eclipse then. We'd like to see it again in Dallas in 2024 if we're not in Israel. So we will see. But this conference coming to Dallas is bringing together just a great group of speakers. Dr. Michael Lake, Colonel David Giammona, Paul Begley, Dr. Carrie Mayday, Michael Boldea, Dave Hodges, David Hebner, Casper McLeod, John Moore, Jamie Walden, David Paxton, Tracy Tennant, Tuv Rose. Look forward to meeting him. Doug Thornton, who just came back from Peru with Timothy Alberino. They investigated the levitating aliens story in the Amazon jungle. That and more. Again, this and I will either be there via video or we'll be there in person. One or the other. April 5th through 8th of 2024. More information and registration at hearthewatchmen.com. The Skywatch TV virtual conference that was scheduled for this fall, postponed until the spring for obvious reasons. The passing of Dr. Tom Horn, his final presentation will be part of that conference. That probably coming in March of next year, but we'll have a firm date on that soon. As soon as I get that from Joe Horn, I will pass that along to you. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen. If you're watching, again, please download our free mobile app and start using that for this process. If you're subscribing to the podcast, whether it's at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, wherever fine podcasts are sold, thank you for doing that. And please tip the headphones to our inimitable announcer, D.C. Good. A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We do this because we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.